have a few comments motivated, I think, from my background as a person who does political science and international relations, but obviously touching on the economy. I have 94 questions and comments. I hope that's okay. No, I have about 7 or 8. It was really fun to read these papers and to view Professor Naughton's PowerPoint presentation in the last week. Professor Naughton started his talk today by mentioning inflation. I'd like to know a little bit more about inflation. He didn't get the chance to come back to that topic later in his presentation as he suggested he might. And in particular, I wonder at what point and how do inflation and asset bubbles start to become embedded as a serious economic problem in China, given that they are already becoming an increasingly serious social and political problem. What I have in mind is, first of all, of course, inflationary expectations. People expect prices to go up, so they raise inflationary expectations. That's already a problem enough. Then there's this other problem of state-owned enterprises reportedly taking out low interest rates, even negative real interest rate loans, and investing them in property, although the state's trying to rein this in. You probably know about that. And so then a high proportion of their revenues and their profits come from property price appreciation, And so I don't know if the research has been done to what extent SOEs are becoming reliant on this, and if they do, at what point it becomes a serious, not just social and political problem, but a serious economic problem that we have to watch out for. In other words, Barry pointed to the other inflationary episodes in the last decade and earlier years. I wonder if there's something qualitatively different about what's going on since the global financial crisis, or at what point we have to conclude that something qualitatively different is going on. Also on inflation, we read a lot and hear a lot about the wage increases in South China and in other places, raising the minimum wage as an indicator of rebalancing starting to take place. Professor Hong talked about rebalancing and its importance. Everybody really mentioned that. So, but to what extent is that actually an indication of rebalancing and or an indication that something like a wage price spiral might be beginning to ignite? If wages rise so that people in lower income groups now have more income, more money to spend on things being produced, at what point do those wage increases get swamped by inflation and contribute to even more inflation so that there's no real shift in the growth model, there's no real rebalancing taking place? Thirdly, it now takes significantly more credit and money growth in the Chinese economy to increase GDP by a percentage point incrementally than it did 7 to 8 years ago. Barry could probably give us the figures right off the top of his head, but it takes significantly more, which would seem to suggest that the high payoff investments have already been made. So I wonder whether this metric suggests larger problems with the Chinese economy, perhaps related to the overwhelming and maybe the increasing importance of the party-state sector or the party-state linked entities relative to the private sector. Are there embedded inefficiencies in the Chinese economy that are becoming more problematically embedded? Does this reflect or portend a slowdown in productivity gains looking ahead? And if so, what would the implications be? So the core question here is, why isn't the Chinese economy using money and credit growth as efficiently as it was using money and credit growth 7 to 8 years ago? Will the trends continue? And actually related to this, Barry talked a bit about credit growth, money supply growth slowing, the rate of growth slowing in 2010 as opposed to 2009. But there was this new metric that was revealed a week or so ago called social finance, the total amount of finance in the economy, not just banks making loans and expanding the money supply through the money multiplier, but also SOEs lending money to other SOEs, or off-balance sheet lending, underground unofficial banks, so-called social finance, which indicated that actually the rate of growth in money and credit did not decline in 2010, it's actually a little bit higher. But it's off the radar screen of the data collectors, and I wonder whether that is something we shouldn't be watching closely. On the property bubble, Barry, at least in his presentation, when I wrote, and a lot of people talk about this, that the property bubble might not be such a problem because mortgages, this is the quotation, finance only 40% of home purchases in China. So this would be a key reason that China would avoid a property bubble collapse. Okay, but what's the overall level of leverage in all property purchasing in China, including not only residential, but also commercial real estate, and even in the related infrastructure building? Don't SOEs and other real estate tycoons borrow at low interest or negative real interest rate loans to invest massively in commercial real estate and in residential real estate that they won't live in, but just as speculative investments? Because if so, then leverage is still going to be a big problem, and I wouldn't be as reassured about the property bubble not collapsing. Fifth, and I only have seven or eight, is the so-called Guojin Mintui, which is the advance of the state and the retreat of the private sector that a lot of people have commented on in the past couple of years. Is that just a temporary phenomenon that the panelists don't worry too much about, or is it a longer-term threat to China's economic dynamism and elan? And does Li Keqiang, who will probably be the next premier succeeding Wen Jiabao, as a non-princeling, who may be a very talented person in many ways, undoubtedly, you don't rise to nearly the top of that system without being very talented, but does he have the right stuff to reverse this Guojin Mintui trend? Does he have the same kind of stuff that Zhu Rongji had? If not, if with each passing generation of leadership in China, from Mao to Deng to Zhang and so on down the line, the leaders become weaker relative to core interests in society, then you would have to worry about these interests entrenching, Guojin Mintui continuing to advance, and that economic dynamism and elan continuing to seed. Sixth, not related to these liquidity and other questions so much, but I wish all the members of the panel would talk a bit more about how you actually can effectively measure an economy's dependence on exports. Because it seems that net exports over GDP doesn't fully capture the magnitude of China's potential dependence on the export sector as an engine of growth. There's a clear difference here between Professor Hong and, on the one hand, Professor Naughton and Holt on the other, in how they view the importance of the export sector to China's overall growth. And I've read other economists suggest that that because of the non-economic, because of like multiplier effects and the non-economic dimensions of these foreign linkages, that actually the importance of trade to China is much greater than the net exports over GDP figure would suggest. And you would think that would be the case. Otherwise, why would they have needed this massive fiscal and monetary stimulus program launched in late 2008 to deal with the looming global financial crisis, the effects of that financial crisis on China? So how can we capture that and measure it? Second to last, primarily for Professor Hong, I wonder if you could talk more about whether it's really an interdependent relationship between China and the United States through this China buying treasuries, the United States buying Chinese exports, or whether it's more one-sided. Because as you suggest sort of later in your paper, if China decides not to buy as many treasuries as in the past, and even private Americans or other foreigners don't step in to fill the void, can't the Fed simply continue its indirect monetization program, or quantitative easing? It would potentially be inflationary, but at least it would be stimulating on the U.S. economy. That would lead presumably to higher capacity utilization in the U.S. economy, lower unemployment, which would then lower the budget deficit anyway, so you wouldn't have as great a need for that kind of finance. So I wonder if you talk about whether it's really interdependence or something more asymmetric. And then finally, for Professor Holtz on the human capital argument, I was able to hear his argument first at the 2-9 restaurant near campus and at a pleasurable lunch we had a week ago. I enjoyed reading the paper too. The assumption here is clearly that everything else has to go exactly right in order for the human capital variable to work its magic. So what probability do you attach to each of the other components, all the other key variables going right? And what probability do you attach to all of them going right together? So I think it's a fascinating argument. I just wonder if you can contextualize it for us so we know what to think about. And particularly, I'm motivated to ask this question by the fact that so many of the new college graduates now being minted, and Barry had some really good data on this, are unemployed. and complaining about being unemployed in China, or severely underplaced, underpaid. So there are obviously some institutional factors in place that are preventing these people, this army, this new human capital, from unleashing their productivity. So how, Karsten, would these institutional factors be eliminated? Surely they won't just wither away. And what else has to happen for the human capital variable to work, and what are the odds? So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.